All right. So I got my notification that we are on and live at this time. So welcome everybody to Harvest Fellowship. Whether you're joining us in person or by the live stream, it's great to have you with us as we prepare to sing some words of worship this evening. Before we do that, let's go ahead and lift up a prayer and we will get started here. Heavenly gracious Father, Lord, we thank you for blessing us with yet another opportunity to come before you to worship you and to grow in you, Lord. And what an awesome God you are that we worship. The God that created space, time, and matter, the three things that can't ever be created or destroyed. You set them all into motion. You didn't pound one nail or screw one screw. You just spoke, and every molecule lined up. Lord, when you speak, the dead come to life. When you speak, the waves calm. What a wonderful God you are that we serve, Lord. Lord, help us to never forget the power that you possess. And Lord, that power resides in us when we believe. Lord, we thank you for extending such wonderful grace and mercy to us, and we praise you for that in your gracious name. Amen. I've got a heart of love for him because of that and for so much more.
I've got a heart full of love for you. I've got a heart full of love for you. And I can't wait to see what you're gonna do with a heart full of love for you. Show presence, shaken by the truth that you are God. No deed will bring you pleasure, or word out of measure to who you are. Bless the Lord with all that's in me. Bless the to give all of me. I'm giving you all of me. I want to give all of me. I'm giving you all of me. Bless the Lord with all that's in me. Bless the Lord. Make kingdoms Jesus. You make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus.
Lord, as we just come to you this evening, would you lead us and guide us in the teaching of your word? Would your Spirit speak and we would listen? Would you open our eyes and ears that we may see wondrous things from your law tonight? May it be for your glory and our good. And we're just thankful for the time to be here tonight. In your name, amen. Good evening, all. You may be seated. And at this time, we'll dismiss the middle schoolers and the teens back to class. And please remember, middle schoolers and teens are in the same room tonight back there. Due to the fellowship hall not being available, the floor is being done. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 5 and chapter 6 tonight. Over the years, I have learned, I've been teaching Wednesday nights now for 25 years. The Wednesday between the holiday of Christmas and New Year's is always such a strange Wednesday. I don't know if people are just burned out by stuff. They kind of drag themselves in, and it seems like it's a tough Wednesday for everybody. So I don't know how tonight's going to go, so I'll just throw that out there right there for you. So if we're feeling that it's not going well, we may just do 5 minutes and we're just all going to go home. But we'll see what's going on here. These are some tough chapters to do because it's getting to the building of the temple. Now, I love this. I love this topic, and I'm really looking forward to it. So we're going to really try to make a valiant effort here. We're going to have to kind of take like an Overwatch position on this and just do an overview of it because the details that get into it are quite extreme. And to be honest, sometimes by reading it, it's actually difficult to follow. I will say this. As you get into the details of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 6, it can get tough to actually follow what they're trying to say. I have found when reading through chapters like 1 Kings 6, I like to have another translation with me. I'm a fan of the New Living Translation as well, and it helps just kind of bring it to light a little bit. So if you're reading through 1 Kings 6 and you find yourself getting confused a little bit, don't be afraid to bring another translation in. I know many of you here probably in the next week or so are going to start a read through the Bible in a year type program, and you're going to get to some chapters in Ezekiel and Kings and Chronicles, and they're going to start using terminology that we're just really not used to. I encourage you to find a Bible here. I have one of my 4 translation Bibles up here where you got all the different translations beside it. So I like to read it in the New King James, and if my mind gets confused, I can jump right over to New Living Translation, for example, and get a clearer picture. And we're going to be quoting New Living Translation a lot tonight, especially when we get to 1 Kings chapter 6. Now, to set the context of what's going on, the kingdom is blessed. We mentioned this last week in 1 Kings chapter 4. This is the golden age of Israel. From a military standpoint, there's really no threats. From a financial standpoint, they are blessed beyond what you can imagine. They have a wise ruler here in Solomon, and they are just in an extremely blessed position. As we talked about last Wednesday, we talked about how this golden age of Israel kind of reminds us of the millennial reign of Christ, and then we even went into the Christmas idea of that, of Jesus coming to rule and reign. So just remember, the kingdom is blessed. The kingdom is at peace. This is the time to build the temple. And what you're going to find out here for the next few chapters, the temple takes center stage. They're going to gather the materials in 1 Kings 5. They're going to get the labor force around in 1 Kings 5. Chapter 6 is going to give us an overview of the building project. Chapter 7 is going to give us a brief description of some other buildings and then go into the detail of the furnishing of the buildings. Then in chapter 8, we're going to get to the dedication of the temple. And everything is just going to flow here in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And if we could just stop right there, that'd be great. But in 1 Kings chapter 11, you see the heart of Solomon turning from the Lord and how sad that is. But until chapter 11, this is just the blessed golden age of Israel. And I want you to keep this in the back of your mind here. And the temple is the focus. This temple is the main detail here that matters. This is God's dwelling place on earth. His glory will come in and dwell the temple. This is how God would interact with Israel. This has been the buildup for hundreds of years. They had the tabernacle for a while there, and now the focus is going to be an actual building, and this building is going to be grand. The description of this building is going to be exalted and magnificent and grand. And you're going to get into that tonight, how absolutely beautiful this is. We have a lot of slides to show you just to kind of help you visualize. Now, remember as you go through 1 Kings 6 and it tries to explain to you what the building looks like, there's a bit of speculation on this. We can get some details, we can maybe get some width, some height, some length, and some of the furnishings, but the actual details of how it all came together, we have an understanding, but we don't know exactly what it looks like, and you'll see that here in a little bit. Now, to set the time frame of what's going on, you're going to see that this starts out in verse 1 of chapter 6. It came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. What matters there most is you see him starting this project here in the 2nd month, in the 4th year. This is going to be around April or May. And what it comes down to at the end of the chapter in verse 37, it's going to take him about 7.5 years to build the temple. So just keep that in the back of your mind. It's about 7.5 years to build the temple. And once again, this temple is going to be described as exalted, glorious, magnificent. And the Chronicles account, it says this. Now David said, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, famous and glorious throughout all countries. Now think about that. That's how the building was supposed to be. Exceedingly magnificent, famous and glorious throughout all countries. That's the goal of this building. Because you were supposed to see this building and stop and say, to God be the glory. Because this is where he dwells. Well, let's get a little more detail on this. Can you actually go with me to 1 Chronicles 28? It's important when reading the story here in Kings to remember there's also another story of it in 1 Chronicles 28 that sometimes adds a little bit more detail. Chronicles was written much later after Kings, and so sometimes their perspective on things just is a tad different. The facts remain the same, but just the perspective is a little different. 1 Chronicles 28. I want to remind you how we got to this point of the temple. If you remember correctly, David wanted to build a house for the Lord. He says, I have this wonderful house and I want to build a house for the Lord. And God came to him and said, you can't build me a house. Your son will build me a house, but you can't. You're a man of war. Blood is on your hands. And he says, instead, David, I will make your family a house, meaning a lineage, and that through you the Messiah would come. So it was promised to David he would have the lineage of the Messiah. This is all back in our study in 2 Samuel. But actually Solomon, his son, would be the one that would build the house. So David knew that Solomon was the one that was going to get to do it. David doesn't just sit there and pout. Instead, he says, now, Lord, I'm going to spend all my time and energy focusing on this house. Look at 1 Chronicles 28, start in verse 10. This is David speaking to Solomon before David died. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. Remember, Solomon is young. Very, very young. And this is a huge project. So David's giving him a pep talk. Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the vestibule, its houses, its treasuries, upper chambers, its inner chambers, and the place of the mercy seat. David actually designed the temple and gave the blueprints to Solomon. And the plans for all that he had by the Spirit, of the courts of the house of the Lord, of all the chambers all around, of the treasuries of the house of God, and of the treasuries for his dedicated things. So God gave the plans to David. David seemed to take the plans, write them out, if you will. He was the architect, and then gave it to Solomon and said, Solomon, now you need to go do this. And continuing on here in verse 13. Also for the division of priests and the Levites, for all the work of the service of the house of the Lord, and for all the articles of silver in the house of the Lord. He gave gold by weight for the things of gold, for all articles used in every kind of service, also silver for all articles of silver by weight, and for all articles used in every kind of service. The weight for the lampstands of gold, and their lamps of gold by weight, for each lampstand its lamps, for the lampstands of silver by weight, for the lampstand and its lamps according to the use of each lampstand. And by weight he gave gold for the tables of the showbread, for each table, and silver for the tables of silver. And also pure gold for the forks, the basins, the pitchers of pure gold, and the golden bowls. He gave gold by weight for every bowl. And for the silver bowl, silver by weight for every bowl. Remember, everything is going to be gold. 18, and refined gold by weight for the altar of incense and for the construction of the chariot. That is the gold cherubim that spread their wings and overshadowed the ark of the covenant of the Lord. All this, said David, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the works of these plans. If you've ever tried to get a grasp of how did the people, when writing these things in the Bible, understand that this was not just an idea. David gives us a hint here in verse 19. The Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the works of these plans. As David is drawing out these plans, He realizes this is God speaking to him to say this is how it's supposed to be. Verse 20, and David said to his son Solomon, be strong and of good courage and do it. Do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you until you have finished all the work for the service of the house of the Lord. And what a beautiful picture that is of the confidence that he gives. And then what happens in 1 Chronicles 29, it goes into the donations. Where did they get all this gold and silver from? David gave his own treasury. The people all gave stuff. So as you're reading through 1 Kings 6 and you see all this gold, where did it come from? It came from there. The grandeur of this project. We can collect some ideas, some estimates. We can try to put some values on this, but the reality is the values keep changing because obviously the amount of gold and silver, what it's worth, keeps changing. This is what we understand here. These are the facts that we've collected. There's going to be 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver. David gave 3,000 talents of gold and 7,000 talents of silver himself. Now, this is an enormous amount. By today's standards, 100,000 talents of gold equals 3,750 tons. Just to put that into perspective there. And 1,000,000 talents of silver is 37,500 tons. We're talking tens of billions of dollars here on what this temple is going to be, quote unquote, worth. This is not including the gold and silver of the shields and all the utensils, etc. In many ways, if you remember correctly, Solomon had so much gold that he made shields of gold. Now, you never take a shield of gold into combat. That's just to look good and to look pretty. So they have all this gold here. Took 7.5 years to build this. We're going to find out in a little bit. 180,000 laborers. 7.5 years, 180,000 laborers. Tens of billions of dollars of gold and silver put into this. And please note, the temple is almost immediately plundered in subsequent reigns right after Solomon. It's just constantly plundered in the Old Testament. Anytime a nation came and overtook Israel, they go to the temple, and they take some gold and silver from it. Eventually reaching the point of literally tearing down the temple and burning it down so that way they could get all the gold in it because it's just full of so much of it. So for this brief, tiny reign of Solomon, he reigned for 40 years. It's the golden age of Israel. Militarily, financially, and dare we say religiously, and then starting in the next reign, the kingdom splits, and anytime a nation conquers Israel, they just come in and take and steal and plunder from the temple. So just keep this in the back of your mind. This is what we're getting into. Back to 1 Kings chapter 5. Let's start with the preparations here. We're going to get into the labor force and the gathering of materials. We're going to make some spiritual application points at the end, so bear with me, please, but we have a lot of context to set. Verse 1 of chapter 5, now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon because he had heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram, has always loved David. Tyre is right up there to the left, to the north, if you will, of Israel. If you can look at a map, it's right there on the Mediterranean Sea. And so they have a good relationship. This Hiram is the one that had been friends with David. Back in 2 Samuel chapter 5, when David was building his house, Hiram came and helped him with stuff, and now he's helping Solomon as well. So Tyre is to the north and to the west of Israel there along the Mediterranean Sea. Then Solomon sent to Hiram saying, you know how my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the wars which are fought against him on every side, until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. And behold, I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to my father David, saying, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, he shall build the house for my name. Now therefore command that they cut down cedars for me from Lebanon, and my servants will be with your servants, and I will pay you wages for your servants according to whatever you say. For now there is none among us who has skill to cut timber like the Sidonians. So basically, he's going to import lumber. If you've ever looked at the topography of Israel and Jerusalem in this area, they don't have these big cedar forests like Lebanon does. So therefore, they're going to get their wood there, and the Bible goes into the detail of this. They're going to cut it down, float it down to them, and they're going to pick it up and do all this type of stuff. So they're making this arrangement because you're going to find out that the temple is built with cedar. Verse 7, so it was when Hiram heard these words of Solomon that he rejoiced greatly and said, blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people. You know, Hiram, we don't know exactly where he stood with the Lord. Chronicles and goes into a little bit more detail about him. He says some other things about God being the creator. Would not surprise me if we saw Hiram up in heaven. but he's spoken of very highly, very nicely here in the Bible. Verse 8, then Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have considered the messages which you've sent me, and I will do all you desire concerning the cedar and the cypress logs. My servants shall bring them down from Lebanon to the sea. I will float them in rafts by the sea to the place you indicate to me. And we will have them broken apart. Then you can take them away, and you shall fulfill my desire by giving food for my household. So they're making a deal. You give us the wood, and we'll give you food. Then Hiram gave Solomon cedar and cypress logs according to all his desire, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20 cores of pressed oil. Thus Solomon gave to Hiram year by year. One translation puts it like this: in return, Solomon sent him an annual payment of 100,000 bushels of wheat for his household and 110,000 gallons of pure olive oil. This is just economy at its greatest. You know, some of my favorite classes in college were micro and macroeconomics, and this is just what we're dealing with here. You have the wood, we have the surplus of food. Let's just make a trade. So the wood comes down, so they're going to get 100,000 bushels of wheat, they're going to get 110,000 gallons of pure olive oil, and they're going to get the trees, and not only get the trees, jump ahead real quick to 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 13. Now King Solomon sent and brought Huram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a bronze worker. He was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill in working with all kinds of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon and did all his work. So Hiram also sends the trees, but he also sends some craftsmen as well too to be able to help do this and put this all together. So you see how this now all comes here? You see the exchange of the wood, you see the exchange of the food. And so look at this, you see Israel has to import some goods, and they're going to export some stuff. There you go, a great micro and macroeconomics lesson of what's going on. Now verse 12, so the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, and he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty together. Remember, he has no adversaries around, he has a good relationship with these kings. They're in a blessed spot. So they got the materials, now they need the workforce. Verse 13. And then King Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel. Basically, he drafted. And the labor force was 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. And Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. So they raised up 30,000 Israelite men to work on this. They're going to go in shifts. You work a month and you get 2 months off, 10,000 each. But Solomon had 70,000, verse 15, who carried burdens, and 80,000 who quarried stone in the mountains. But he also had this other workforce as well that were forced labor. These were Canaanites that were still men were not put into forced labor. They were drafted to go work, and they did their work in these shifts, 2 months off, 1 month on. But this forced labor here of 150,000 people in verse 15, these we find out later are the Canaanites left in the land that are now put into forced labor. Besides 3,300 from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies who supervised the people who labored in the work. So you have this workforce of 180,000 people. You have 3,300 basically supervisors that are taking care of it. And the king commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones and hewn stones to lay the foundation of the temple. We find out later that the size of these stones, some of them were 15 feet long and 12 feet long. Those are big stones. So, verse 18, so Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Gibeonites quarried them, and they prepared timber and stones to build the temple. Just bear with me here in chapter 5. They get the wood, they make an exchange for the grain and the oil. They have a workforce of 180,000 people, 30,000 are Israelites that have 2 months on, 1 month off, 150,000 forced labor, 3,300 supervisors, and then these stones that they're working with, big stones, 12 feet, 15 feet long stones. And this has now got everything set up. We see in Chronicles that they got the blueprints from David, who got it from the Lord. We see in 1 Chronicles 29, all the gold and silver has been given by David's own treasury or donated by the people. So they have everything ready to actually start building the temple. And that's what we get into in 1 Kings chapter 6. Let's pause real quick. Any quick questions, comments about anything here to make sure we're all on the same page? We're good? John?
How far they had to transfer those large stones?
No, we don't know for sure. We find out later on in verse 7, I believe, of chapter 6. Jump ahead to 7 of chapter 6. And the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. So the quarry was far enough away you couldn't hear anything, but it sounds like it was fairly close there. Which, if any of you have ever worked construction, verse 7 is an amazing verse. I mean, just think about that for a second. I mean, I just envision, if you've ever been to any type of building project, there's always something going on. Somebody is sanding, somebody's cutting, somebody's nailing, somebody has got an air compressor going, there's equipment, there's something. You got to the temple in verse 7, and there's no hammer, there's no chisel, there's no iron tool. The stones fit together perfectly. That's amazing. These huge 15-foot, 12-foot long stones are cut out of a quarry a ways away, taken there to the temple, and wouldn't you know it, when they come together to be fit, they're fit wonderfully. Now, I don't want you to think that this was just some type of flip a coin and the stone's the right size. I think the assumption is that these craftsmen went, measured what they were supposed to measure, sent the requirements back and said, hey, we need one that's 8 feet by 4 foot by 3 foot, and the people in the quarry get one that's 8 foot by 4 foot by 3 foot, and they come, and it just slides right in. So any of you that work in any type of construction, I hope you appreciate 1 Kings 6, verse 7, because what an amazing verse that is. But back to John's question. Quarry must have been close enough that it wasn't a problem, but far enough away that you couldn't hear the sound of what was working on it. Anybody else have anything here before we go on? Okay. Verse 1 we've already read, but let's just set the tone here again. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. We've mentioned many times before, when you read the Old Testament, very rarely does it give a specific date, because the context is not about dates. As we've said before, in our Western American mindset of history, everything is dates. You guys can remember back to your junior high classes, they made you memorize dates. They made you memorize the order of the presidents and all this other type of stuff. When it comes to the Bible is like, you know what? It's not so much the date, it's what God was doing. So that's why a lot of times when you go through the Kings and Chronicles, it's hard to sometimes get a proper chronology going, because that's not God's purpose. So when you see a verse like verse 1 that goes into this much detail, make note of it, because God is saying, I want you to know it's been 480 years since the Exodus. It's hard to lose track. I should say it's hard to keep track of time sometimes in the Bible. That you have a tendency to read a book of the Bible and you're like, well, I wonder how much time just passed. Like when you read the book of Judges, all of a sudden you stop and you realize, wow, hundreds of years just passed. So to keep you in the mindset here, if you're going from Moses and Exodus up into 1 Kings chapter 6, it's 480 years. That's how much time has passed. And it just gives you the first bit here to tell you when the project started, April, May, and it takes 7.5 years. 7.5 years here for the project to be completed. We find that out at the end of 1 Kings 6. All right, now let's get into this. Verse 2. Now the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height 30 cubits. This is where it gets hard. Cubit is basically understood as 18 inches. So it kind of makes the math really easy. So when you start seeing something like 60 cubits, you can just do quick math in your head and you can realize it's 90. You kind of just start training yourself to do that, or just get a different translation, like the New Living Translation, that will just say the temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. That's why I like New Living Translation sometimes when I'm reading through the Bible, because it's nice just to be able to read that and say, okay, the temple is 90 by 30 by 45. Now, let's get some visuals on this. Tweets, can you put up the first slide there if you don't mind? All right, I got some slides here that I want to show you to kind of give you a visual of what this temple looks like. And hopefully we can get a good picture of this. So keep in the back of your mind there in verse 2, 90 feet by 30 feet by 45 feet. And then we're going to start breaking these down and getting an idea of it. Let's go ahead and do verse 3 as well while they're getting up there. The vestibule in front of the sanctuary of the house was 20 cubits long across the width of the house, and the width of the vestibule extended 10 cubits from the front of the house. And he made for the house windows with beveled frames. Against the wall of the temple, he built chambers all around. Against the walls of the temple, all around the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary, thus he made side chambers all around it. What you're going to see is you have the structure of the temple, and then you're going to have some storage alongside. But we'll come back to that in a second. Now, I like this. This is one of my favorite pictures to give you something. Okay, right here's the tabernacle. So that's what you had in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is the tabernacle. This is Solomon's temple. This is what we're building right here. I love this because it gives us a nice perspective. American football field. So just a nice picture for you to be able to say, okay, I think everybody in this room can visualize a football field. So Solomon's temple, we're probably getting maybe, 60, 70 yards. And you can see how small the tabernacle is. Herod's temple. So that's the temple that Jesus would have gone to. Herod, what he did is he expanded the temple so much, if I remember correctly, it was 30 plus acres, around 33 acres, that he made the entire complex eventually. He just kept growing it. And that's why when the disciples saw Herod's temple, if you remember correctly, in Matthew chapter 4, they look at Jesus and say, isn't this building amazing? Because it was amazing. You can see how they kept getting bigger. Now this one right here, that's the millennial reign temple out of the book of Ezekiel. That one is a whole nother level. So that is the millennial reign when Jesus rules and reigns on earth for 1,000 years. And you get to see the grandeur of Ezekiel's temple that we'll get into detail when we get to the book of Ezekiel. But this just gives you a nice visual of what you're looking at here to kind of get a feel for what the size of Solomon's temple is going to be. Okay, here is Solomon's temple. Right here, Herod's temple. Once again, just to kind of give you a bit of a basis there, so often when we think of the temple, the first thing we think of is Herod's temple. Herod's temple was not really a temple of God. If you remember correctly, Solomon's temple is going to get destroyed here by Babylon in 586 BC, and eventually they build another temple, Zerubbabel does, if you've ever studied out the book of Zechariah. And Zerubbabel's temple, when it was built, was so meager that the older generation, when they saw it, wept, because they remembered Solomon's. Herod's temple became just a tourist attraction in many ways. History teaches us that you would go visit Herod's temple. There were still religious things that were happening at it. They still had the sacrifices that were going on. But as far as we can tell, they didn't even have the Ark of the Covenant at Herod's temple. And that the Holy of Holies was supposedly empty. Because they had lost the Ark of the Covenant, and really God's presence really wasn't there in many ways, because what happened is that it became something that really wasn't of the Lord. But that's another teaching for another day. But you can see once again the size differences here. Now, I like this picture a lot. This is an artist's rendering of what he thought Solomon's temple would look like. Obviously, it's been cut out. So you got your altar right here, and it was a big altar. We won't get into that this week. We'll get into that next week. And that would be perpetually going. You start out the morning with the burnt offering, and you kept it going. The fire kept going, and so therefore you would always have the altars. You have this basically pool of water here, which we'll get to that once again later, how many thousands of gallons of water are going to be in that. You also have these right here for other washings. So you'd walk in, you have the two pillars right here, which we'll get into later. You come in, and this area right here is where you have your showbread, you have your lampstands, and you have your altar of incense. Once again, we'll get into that all next week. We're going to spend some time here, though, today. We're going to have the two cherubim statues, the Ark of the Covenant right there, and that's what we're going to get into. This is all gold. Everything's going to be completely covered in gold in there. It's going to be cedar covered in gold. And that's going to be a pretty big room. We're just going to leave this picture up so that way you can hopefully visualize it. Now, when we're reading through 1 Kings chapter 6, and we start getting into these things of along the sides there, like verse 5, against the wall of the temple, he built chambers all around against the walls of the temple, all around the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary. Thus, he made side chambers all around it. Side chambers. So you can see that. The lowest chamber was 5 cubits wide, the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. And he made narrow ledges around them, around the outside of the temple, so that the support beams would not be fastened to the walls of the temple. Verse 6 sounds a little confusing, but what you're seeing is the structure was attached to the temple, but not really directly connected to the temple. The best we can figure there is this idea of these beams kind of came out of the temple, and they kind of supported these structures on it. So this stuff is literally right beside the temple, but it's kind of a separate structure, but yet it's kind of connected right there as well, too, because the temple is its own separate thing. We read verse 7, but in the temple, when it was being built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer, chisel, or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. You needed these storages here, and 3 layers of storage, because there's a lot going on. This is the center, the epicenter of what's happening. You need to have storage. That's just the way it is. I was talking to someone today, and when Dawn and I built our house, we had 2 kids. Now we have 7 kids. Things changed. We added a bedroom down in our basement. We added a bathroom down in our basement. We took one of the garage and turned half of our garage into another bedroom because for some reason we kept having kids. And so therefore you needed more space. Same thing happens here at church. Things just grow. You need more space. You need storage. This would never stop. You need all this storage. You need the storage of the utensils. You need the storage of the clothes. You need the storage of everything that's going on. You just need storage. And so there's 3 layers of it right there, connected to the temple, but yet separate from the temple, because the temple is its own thing. So let's go on here a little bit more. We're going to get now, and I want you to start noticing how often you see the words cedar and gold and cherubim. New King James is going to mention cedar 8 times, gold 12 times, and cherubim 9 times. That's the focus of today, is cedar, gold, and cherubim. It's kind of hard to see, but this is all going to be decorated with cherubim and palm trees and things like that. There's some big cherubim in there. We'll get to the cherubim in a little bit, but it's cedar with gold over it, and then these cherubim. 8. The doorway for the middle story was on the right side of the temple. They went up by the stairs to the middle story, and from the middle to the third. We're still talking about this section right over here. So they built the temple and finished it, and he paneled the temple with beams and boards of cedar. And he built side chambers against the entire temple, each 5 cubits high. Once again, that's still on the side. They were attached to the temple with cedar beams. Then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, now, there's a bit of a pause right here. Now, a couple thoughts on this. Basically, this is a pep talk from God. I don't know if Solomon was getting discouraged and he needed a bit of a pep talk. We don't know. Was there some pride to remind him? I kind of look at the context of what's saying is once he gets to 14 and 15, he's working on the inside. And it's almost like, to me, when I read through this, is like God's almost reminding him, you're getting to the important stuff now. Yeah, storage is important. 3 stories of it. Really what matters is what's going to happen on the inside. Verse 12, concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments, and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David, and I will dwell among the children of Israel and not forsake my people Israel. I look at it as just a pep talk here. Solomon, you can do this. This is a tough project. I remember when I first came out here at church, as the head pastor 20-some years ago, my degree from college is in finance. And so I always was excited about meetings. I don't know why. I remember being in college thinking, how cool is it going to be to go to work and I have a tie on with a briefcase and I get to go to meetings. And so what happened was we came out here and we had some building projects and I had to come to meetings. I hated them. I remember one time telling Nancy, who was the secretary out here, saying, hey, about 15 minutes, can you just come get me and tell me I had a phone call? Because I just didn't want to be in the meeting. No one listened to what I had to say. It was construction stuff. No one cared. You guys sit out here and it's like, oh, James, he knows the Bible, whatever. Yeah, but when we get into a board meeting and something mechanical happens, no one pays attention to a word I have to say about anything. There's no respect in any way whatsoever. So I just sat in these meetings for no reason. I'm not bitter about it, but I really am. But the point is what it comes down to is it's hard. Building projects are hard. I know they look exciting and fun, but it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work here. And I see this as a bit of a pep talk for Solomon in the midst of this project. So moving on. He built the inside walls of the temple with cedar boards. From the floor of the temple to the ceiling, he paneled the height with wood, and he covered the floor of the temple with planks of cypress. Can you imagine what that smelled like? Oh, man. We were at the creek, I can't remember if it was a couple years ago, and we go back to the creek behind our house, and it's always kind of exciting to see what you can find in the creek to pull out. And so the boys found this very beautiful log, and we pulled it out, and by the time we got it back, it was cedar. And it was a cedar log, and we cut it up in chunks, and so when we'd go out and do a fire at night, every now and then we'd throw a chunk of cedar on it. And just the smell was just absolutely beautiful there. I don't know how a smell can be beautiful. I don't know if that was the right word. But the smell was absolutely amazing, I should say. So you got this cedar and cypress, 16. Then he built the 20-cubit room at the rear of the temple from floor to ceiling with cedar boards. He built it inside as the inner sanctuary as the most holy place. That's right there, most holy place. And in front of the temple sanctuary was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar, carved with ornamental buds and open flowers. All was cedar. There was no stone to be seen. So now we're getting into a little bit of the decoration. So you're going to get into flowers and buds in here, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. He prepared the inner sanctuary inside the temple to set the ark of the covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold and overlaid the altar of cedar. So you have this pure gold now with everything around it. Now we're getting into the detail of the Holy of Holies there in verse 20. 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. That's big. 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. So a 30 by 30 room, this is a decent sized room. I think one of the offices back there, when we did the addition, I think we're basically pretty close to 20 by 20. So if you've ever been in my office or Tony's office or Pat's, you kind of get a feel there of a 20 by 20. So 30 by 30, a little bit bigger, but 30 by 30 by 30. We're not talking 8-foot ceilings, 30 foot. That's a big room. Not only a big room, verse 20, pure gold. That's something else. Now, from our earthly perspective, that's amazing. You get to the Revelation, and what are the foundations laid with? Gold. Because that's nothing to the Lord. But from our perspective, this is absolutely amazing. So 21, so Solomon overlaid the inside of the temple with pure gold. He stretched gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. The whole temple he overlaid with gold until he had finished all the temple. He also overlaid with gold the entire altar that was built by the inner sanctuary. Inside the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. Now, these are huge. These are going to be quite big to kind of give you an idea here how big these cherubim are. They're going to be 15 feet tall with a wingspan of 15 feet. So each has a wingspan of 7.5 feet. And there's going to be 2 of them. And you can see a picture right here. Once again, speculation. It's hard to tell what a cherubim looks like. I can tell you right now, cherubim are not fat little baby toddlers. So when you see those pictures of cherubim wearing a little loincloth and little wings and curly hair, that is the complete opposite. When you go read the book of Ezekiel and you see a description of cherubim, it would freak you out if you saw one. And now cherubim, when you see them in the Bible, always seem to be in connection with God's glory. If you remember correctly, in the Garden of Eden, after sin entered the world, God sent cherubim to guard the tree of life. They're described in detail in the book of Ezekiel. An interesting passage in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 9. On top of the mercy seat, you have the Ark of the Covenant. Then on top of it, you had a pure gold mercy seat where sacrifices, the blood would be put on the Day of Atonement. And there are 2 cherubim on that. I don't think we can see it real good in there. I don't know if you guys want to look. We should have a picture of the Ark there somewhere. If they find it, great. But there's 2 on it. But throughout the Bible, it's said that God dwells between the cherub. Hebrews 9:5 says, the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. So when you think of cherubim, think of glory. That's why the cherubim are in there. So, and now these cherubim, once again, are big, 15 feet tall, wingspan of 15 feet, each 7.5 feet. Put this into perspective. If they have a wingspan of 15 feet and there's 2 of them and the room is 30 foot wide, guess what? From wingtip to wingtip, the entire room is covered in these cherubim. So you are under the wings of the cherubim when you go into the Holy of Holies here. We're running out of time, so let's see if we can pick up the pace here a little bit. 23, inside the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the cherub was 5 cubits, the other wing of the cherub 5 cubits, 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. Once again, as we mentioned before, we're talking 7.5 feet there, total wingspan of 15. And the other cherub was 10 cubits. Both cherubim were of the same size and shape. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, 15 feet, and so was the other cherub. Then he set the cherubim inside the inner room, and they stretched out the wings of the cherubim so that the wings of one touched one wall, and the wing of the other cherubim touched the other wall, and their wings touched each other in the middle of the room. And he overlaid the cherubim with gold. So now you have this olive wood now overlaid with gold. Then he carved all the walls of the temple around both the inner and outer sanctuaries with carved figures of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. Cherubim represent the glory of God. Palm trees and flowers, speculative guess by most people, is it's supposed to take you back to the Garden of Eden mindset, the epitome of creation, of God's glory and the perfectness of that. 30, and the floor of the temple he overlaid with gold, both the inner and outer sanctuaries. We can't imagine this. You'd walk into that 30 by 30 by 30 room, and it's just all gold. There you go. That's the idea here. This is the Ark of the Covenant. So often when we think of the Ark, we think of the whole thing. This is the Ark right here, and this has had the pot of manna. This had Aaron's Aaron's rod that budded. This had the 10 Commandments in it. This is something different. That is actually the mercy seat. And you have the 2 cherubim over it, and their wings are kind of covering the glory of God. And they would go in on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, one day a year, and they would go sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat there. So this is the ark. That's the mercy seat on top of it. Fun little study if you take the word for mercy seat, how it equates to our word for propitiation in the New Testament there. And it's supposed to show the covering that we have of our sin. We don't have time to get into that, though, right now. Let's move on here real quick and see how much further we can get. 31, for the entrance of the inner sanctuary made doors of olive wood. The lintel and the doorposts were 1/5 of the wall. The 2 doors were of olive wood, and he carved on them figures of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. You see that decorative again. And overlaid them with gold. He spread gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So for the door of the sanctuary, he also made doorposts of olive wood, 1/4 of the wall. And the 2 doors were of cypress wood. 2 panels comprised one folding door, and 2 panels comprised the other folding door. Then he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers on them, and overlaid them with gold applied evenly on the carved work. And he built the inner court with 3 rows of hewn stone and a row of cedar beams. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its details, and it was according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it, 7.5 years to build the temple. Time is short. Let me make a couple quick application points here, and we'll get into next week the actual things that are going on in the temple. We'll get to the altar, we'll get into the cart, the pool outside, we'll get into all these things and the furnishings of the temple. The temple is beautiful. I mean, there's no doubt about it. To see this would be awe-inspiring. It's costly, but we have to remember, in all of its glory and all of its beauty, it's only, as Hebrews says, a shadow, a copy of what heaven is. So we got to remember that. Hebrews makes it very clear in Hebrews chapter 9. It repeats shadow, copy, pattern. Be very, very careful that we never get so caught up in what's going on in this world that we forget the true goal. Our citizenship is in heaven. That's where our home is. This town, the city that has foundations that can never be shaken, as the Bible says. And I don't know about you, but we have a tendency in this world, and maybe you don't, maybe I should say me, I have a tendency in this world sometimes to forget the stability of eternity, the glory of eternity. I can get worked up by news reports. I can get worked up by the politics that are going on, health issues, whatever it is. And I have to stop and remember, this is not my home. There's an eternal home whose builder and maker is God, who has a city whose foundations will never be shaken. And when I even see the glory of this building, it's only a copy, a pattern, a shadow of what's actually coming. And think about a shadow. You don't want the shadow, you want the real thing. If you came to me and said, boy, I'm really thirsty, and I said, I have a cup of water here for you, and say, can I have it? I'd say, you can have the shadow of it. You want the water. You take a child away from its mom and say, but hey, honey, you can look at mom's shadow. They don't want the shadow. They want mom. Just be careful you don't get so caught up in this world that you're content with shadows and copies and patterns, where we're supposed to be desiring something deeper. I always think back to Matthew 6:33, where it's seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. So it's seeking him first. And the temple is really a great reminder of God's glory, but it's still, once again, only a shadow copy pattern of what it is. Fun to study, fun to get into, and we'll get into it more later. One last thing I'll say here before we close up. Be very careful when getting into a study, for example, of the tabernacle and temple. If you just type in, and I don't recommend you do, Solomon's Temple like into YouTube, you'll get 100 people that's got some funky ideas out there. Be very careful getting into speculation with this. Keep it the way it's supposed to be. God's glory, for his glory, built for that, for the sacrificial system that it was. I believe there is some symbolism in it. We'll get into that next week, and I believe we can back that up scripturally. But just be very careful going down sometimes some of these roads that we shouldn't be going down. You'll get to some areas that are not just as edifying as they could be. All right, almost 8 o'clock. We got a couple minutes here. Any quick final questions, comments about anything? I know we covered a lot. Yeah, Karen.
I know that there's some tabernacles around even modern day. What do you think those are about?
Tabernacles around today?
Yeah, like in Defiance, I know there's a tabernacle.
Oh, I think they're just using that as a term for the name of their church.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's all they're using it for.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything here before I close up?
I've never been in this room before.
Me neither.
But do we have any idea what it might sound like 30 years ago?
You know, it's interesting you say that, because I think it would have been quieter than what we can imagine. Because the stones are so big, and then you have the cedar, and then you have the gold. And the reality is, in the Holy of Holies, there would only be one person in there at a time. And then even in the other part of the temple where there's the showbread, the menorahs, and the altar of incense, only one priest would be going in. So I think in some ways it would be very quiet, I think, in some ways, if that makes any sense. And even in the Holy of Holies, it was dark. We haven't gotten into it today, but the only light would have been in the other part of the temple where the menorahs were. But if you went into the Holy of Holies aspect, there's a wall there blocking it. There is no light, and so it would be darkness, which is actually kind of cool as well, too. So, I mean, maybe it was loud if you were the priest that dropped the menorah. I guess it would probably ring out. But the reality is it probably was quieter than what we think because just the size and how few people was in it. Just my opinion. Speculative. Anybody else have anything? Yeah.
The stones being moved in the temple, what kind of aliens do you think helped them do that?
You go to YouTube and type in Solomon's Temple. You will find out what aliens moved the stones. And you'll find out a lot of other things as well, too, that you can't forget. Yeah.
Do we have any idea how thick the gold would have been to fill that area? Thousands of tons?
Yeah, I think it came out to be 3,750 is what one person estimated. And it says it's overlaid with gold. The Bible would tell you if something was pure gold. Like the menorah in the tabernacle was one piece of hammered gold. If I remember correctly, once again, I think I referenced earlier, the mercy seat was gold. A lot of this other stuff is wood overlaid with gold, like verse 22, the whole temple overlaid with gold. I don't know how thick, I don't know. I mean, that's, I really don't know. It kind of comes across like it's thicker than what I think, because a lot of times today when we think of something being overlaid with gold, it really is like the thinnest gold you can imagine. My assumption it would be thicker than what we would deal with today because of the vast amount they're dealing with here, but the Bible just says overlaid. Which once again, now we're back to the amazingness of these craftsmen. And it's actually kind of neat. The craftsmen that were mentioned to build the stuff in the tabernacle, now we're back to, Exodus. These were gifted men by God, like almost like a gift of the Spirit to do, because the workmanship they would have to do would be unbelievable. And the tools that they would have to do it. So there was definitely a gifting here by God to do this type of craftsmanship, overlaying this stuff with gold. It's fascinating. All right, anybody else? Yeah, Renee.
Oh, I was just thinking when you were going through the different temples and you had them up there, you could see like Solomon to Herod to then the millennial reign. I guess it keeps getting better and better. So it makes you look forward to like, wow, heaven and how the streets of gold in heaven are just, it's like God is the ultimate craftsman and I wonder what it's going to be.
And it builds then to, if you get to Revelation, the New Jerusalem. Literal interpretation, the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. It's even more massive than what we can look at. The New Jerusalem, according to the measurements in Revelation, is basically the size of the moon. Fascinating to stop and think about, just the grandeur. Reminds me of that passage in Romans, how unsearchable are the things of God. Anybody else have anything here before we close up? All right, so next week, we'll continue on and we'll get into more details of the temple here. Like I said, we're doing a very quick overview of everything, not going to all the detail we could, because I think it's good to get the context of it. Let me share with you real quick just some upcoming announcements here. Things are kind of winding down a little bit. We've always learned over the years that we don't do a whole lot in the month of January just because of weather and everything that's going on. Do note, next Wednesday, though, we do have a fellowship meal. Hope you can make it out for that. Starts at 5:45. Meal will go into 6:30. Come on out. Be blessed. Stick around for church as well, too. Also, this coming Friday is a family game night. The teens had a game night last week. It was a real neat blessing. This coming Friday, I believe it's from 7 to 9. The details are back there on the back the back bulletin board. This is open to all families. So just come on out. If you're by yourself, come on out. If you want to come out with your family, whatever it is, open to all ages there. Come on out and be blessed and just have a nice, fun evening there as well. Church, obviously, on Sunday, even though it's New Year's Day, we'll have both services, 9 o'clock, 10:30, normal services. And check once again with your small group leaders just to make sure things are going on with all the holidays that are going on. Soldiers back there to my left, continue to keep them in prayer. Thank you gifts also to my left for those that serve in the different areas of church as well. And I believe I'm missing something, but I can't remember what it is. Just stay off the hallway and the fellowship hall for tonight. we'll get clear to go back and do that. They redid the floors back there here during a little bit of the break as well, too. Oh, Mom's Group, that's what it was. Mom's Group starting up Monday, January 2nd. You can see on the back of the bulletin there from 6 to 9. Ladies, I encourage you to come out. When we were doing this years ago, what a blessing it was. I hope you can make it out Monday, January 2nd from 6 to 7 out here at church. Come out and be blessed by that as well. I think that's most everything. So, hey, you guys have a good week. God bless. Have a happy new year, and we will catch you next Wednesday then. Take care.